Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm going to try at the end of my testimony to address some of the questions that have been raised because I think we have some answers to. But I want to thank you. I want to thank the sponsors. I'm going to talk briefly about both bills. I want to thank Speaker Mattiello and his staff for working on the resolution for many, many hours. We didn't start the journey together, I'll just say, but I think we're going to finish it awfully close. I want to thank Representative Marcello, who had to leave, for sponsoring his resolution for 6 years and sticking with it. We've long supported the language that is in Representative Marcello's resolution, H7577. We, Common Cause, originally authored that text in 2009 after the Rhode Island Supreme Court case in Irons versus the Rhode Island Ethics Commission. As you heard Phil West say, the majority opinion in that case said that even though the ethics amendment in Article 3, Section 8 had to yield to the speech and debate clause, that this could be changed by a sufficiently explicit constitutional amendment. And we've taken that as our standard ever since. And that is what we believe is represented in H7577. Since last week when the Speaker came out with his proposal in 8189, we've examined it to make sure that it meets this sufficiently explicit criteria. As has been pointed out, it does not contain all the language in Representative Marcello's resolution, and we think that it would certainly benefit from that additional language, and as several witnesses have already said, we would ask that the committee choose to put that back in, particularly that key phrase, and adjudicate. We shared that in a letter to the Speaker late last week, our belief about that. After determining that it met our criteria in terms of being sufficiently explicit, we set out to look at the rest of the Speaker's resolution 8189. First, we looked at the change from a simple majority to a 2/3 vote. Common Cause supports this change for the rulemaking power because we think that it's not a bad thing to have it occur with greater consensus. There are many supermajority votes in law, in rules, elsewhere. So your rules contain supermajority votes. The Rhode Island general laws contain supermajority votes, as we'll find out on budget night. There's a requirement for a supermajority vote for the budget as a whole. And in fact, Robert's Rules of Order say that supermajority votes of 2/3, what we see here, should be used anytime there are changes that affect minority rights. So we support that. Another significant change that has been much discussed tonight is this moratorium on complaints. As the Speaker actually read our testimony that we put out in advance. Vimala on our staff went through all the minutes for the last 10 years of the Ethics Commission, and every month they report the number of complaints they have, and then put that into an Excel spreadsheet, and then we handed it off he just had to leave, Professor Myers, who's a political scientist at Providence College and is on our board, and he did a very simple statistical analysis. He looked at the number of complaints reported at the October and November meetings.
Do you have any former elected officials on your board?
Yes, we have 2 former members of the Cranston City Council. Yes, the results of the test were that when you compare the 2 months in an election year, as the Speaker said, you have an average of 18 complaints per month. When you compare the other 22 months in the election cycle, you have an average of 9.7 complaints. And that passes a simple t-test for statistical significance, which means that we can have 95% or greater certainty that did not occur by chance. So that meets the basic test. So we know that there is a spike in complaints in the 2 months prior to the election. However, as other witnesses have said, Common Cause feels strongly that this moratorium should not be in the Constitution The Constitution is a document for laying out our basic principles, not managing the day-to-day policies of a commission. To emphasize that point, we submitted a letter today to the commission that is included in the written testimony I shared with you, asking the commission to consider adopting a regulation that would impose a moratorium. As I point out in that letter, the commission has precedent for imposing limits on its power. Just in 2013, I think in June of 2013, it imposed a statute of limitations after some deliberation among commissioners about a statute of limitations. There is no statute of limitations in the general laws for complaints to the Ethics Commission, but the Ethics Commission said 6 years seems like a sufficient statute of limitations, and they imposed that. In the same way, we think they could impose a moratorium on complaints. It's worth mentioning, because I don't think it has been emphasized enough, this doesn't mean that a complaint won't be received. It just means the complaint would be received after the election is passed. So if it's a valid complaint, by all means, it gets submitted the day after the election, and it goes through the regular Ethics Commission process. Our suggestions for the moratorium are, one, it should be shorter in length, as the review of the complaints that the speaker cited indicates. There's a spike about 60 days before. If you add September to that analysis, it's not statistically significant. So we're not seeing the spike occurring early in the election cycle. It's at the end. We also believe that as Representative Craven talked about, the Ethics Commission's right to initiate complaints independent of a public complaint should be preserved, particularly because the legislature passed a statute years ago requiring that all candidates submit financial disclosure forms, and it would be difficult for them to enforce that without the ability to file a complaint for those who don't comply. And finally, I'll just comment on this question of the judicial appeal. This proposal clarifies that anyone found in violation of the code is afforded an appeal before the Superior Court. We believe this added sentence, which really preserves the status quo, is good, because we believe the status quo has served us well for the last 29 years. So again, I'll thank you for the opportunity to testify. I will be happy to answer any questions. I guess the one other point I'd like to make on Representative Filippi's point about would this require them to adopt all their regulations again, I think that's a very good question. As Jason alluded to, there's actually a bill from the administration in front of the committee. I think it might even be on tomorrow night, but from the Office of Regulatory Reform, where they're attempting to sort of streamline regulations. And that bill in its current form will require all administrative agencies that have promulgated rules under the APA in a matter of years to readopt all of their regulations. So this may be happening regardless of this effort. It may be happening because the APA is about to change that process too. So happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for John? Representative O'Grady.
Just one. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your testimony, and thanks also for clarifying for us where those statistics came about the spike in complaints. I'm curious if maybe you don't know the answer to this, but assuming that many of those complaints, or the marginal increase in those complaints, were spurious or based on some attempt to game the electoral process, wouldn't you assume that if you impose just a 2-month moratorium or blackout, or whatever we're calling it, that would simply cause the gamemanship to take place a little earlier in the cycle? Is that a reasonable assumption?
Perhaps, but I think we all know that much like the intensity of campaigns picks up at the end, and the folks who are doing opposition research or sending out releases to try to get attention picks up as the campaign goes on. And I think in as much as these are used as sort of political tools, they're used at the end, maybe even as a desperate measure from a losing candidate to gain some attention that they're not receiving otherwise because of other failures of their campaign or whatnot. I think you may shift it a little bit, but I would expect that wouldn't account for the whole lot of them. I don't think you're going to see on average a spike of almost, as the speaker said, 100% suddenly in August because a moratorium is about to go into effect in September.
Representative Agello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hear that, and it makes sense that maybe there wouldn't be so many. But if the Ethics Commission is taking up to 180 days, which is 6 months, to reach a decision, and they can extend that, they are accepting then a complaint and looking at it, and it's hanging over that candidate's head until past the election, quite likely. So if there's not a way to assure that if a complaint is accepted to be heard, it will be dispatched before an election, it seems to me that I guess that the time limit or the blackout should fit with the commission's capacity to deal with a complaint and see it through.
Yeah, so if I understand your question, thinking through it, if a complaint's received before the blackout period, it doesn't mean that they can't continue to process the complaint. So the person could be, quote unquote, exonerated during the blackout period. So that's one part of my answer. The other is, the thing to know about our ethics process is it's the most transparent there is, right? So in many jurisdictions, complaints are received, and when they're received, they're kept as a secret. They're kept as a secret often until the probable cause stage. And Common Cause decades ago, and back in Phil West's tenure, fought that because we didn't think it was in the public interest to keep these things secret. And ultimately, we won that, and for 3 decades, they haven't been, almost 3 decades, haven't been secret. The flip side of making them all transparent is it adds some sort of validity to complaints that have been received. And so there is another way to deal with this, which is you don't impose a blackout or a moratorium, but you keep things secret. And people really don't like their government keeping things secret from them. So I would submit that a moratorium that simply says we're not going to take them for this short period, but it may be valid, come back November 9th, and we'll be happy to deal with you, is much better than a government saying, I can't confirm or deny that I've received a complaint from a member of the public, and I won't be able to confirm or deny that for some indeterminate period until we may not get to adjudicating that complaint that I can't say that we've received. And I've seen that dance in other states, and it's not a very pretty dance. And the public does not like to hear from their government that the government may or may not have a document that a press release may say they've gotten. It just doesn't help.
Representative Filippi.
Thank you. I'd like to speak a little bit about third-party initiated complaints and complaints initiated by the Ethics Commission themselves. Currently, all elected officials have submitted ethics disclosures for our 2015 activity. After the declaration period, challengers who aren't currently in elected office, they're going to be sent an ethics disclosure once they become a candidate. And they're required under current law to submit that, and if they don't, the Ethics Commission institutes an action against them. Under this moratorium, how would the Ethics Commission or the state address someone who fails, a challenger who fails to submit the required Ethics Commission disclosure for 2015 activity?
As currently written in the proposed resolution, I don't think there is any way for the commission to deal with that.
So all of us have submitted ours. Any challengers, if this passes, and this would be 2018 because obviously it wouldn't apply to this year, challengers at that point wouldn't be able to be prosecuted by the Ethics Commission because they've declared, and now we're in a blackout period.
Yeah, all you could do is resort to sort of the power of the press and shaming them into saying you didn't submit it, and the commission could confirm that they didn't submit it because when the press requests it, the commission could say we don't have one.
But if we limited the blackout...
But yes, I think I agree with your point, which is that both the incumbent and the challenger should have to play by the same set of rules.
But if we limited the blackout period to just third-party complaints, this wouldn't be an issue.
I think that would alleviate that problem, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Jason? Yes, Representative Coughlin.
When you say not take a complaint, are you saying you don't file it officially, or you send it back to, or the Ethics Commission would send it back to the complainant and tell them to resubmit at the end of the period?
Yeah, I obviously don't speak for the commission, but the language I've seen in other jurisdictions, and there are several other jurisdictions that have blackout windows, some just for ethics complaints, some for other types of complaints, such as even campaign finance complaints, which I find curious to have a blackout window before an election. The language suggests they get sent back, right? So you send a letter to a commission, and they send it back and say, they cite the law that prohibits them from taking the complaints, and I don't know whether or not they say resubmit it after the election or not, but the law makes it evident that you can resubmit it after the election. The blackout window is over. So my guess would be that the Ethics Commission would adopt some sort of policy of having a form letter that they send you saying, here's why we can't take your complaint right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions for Jason?
Or John.
John,
It's okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.